Welcome to Take It With a Grain of Sugar, a podcast from Phinova exploring the science and future of metabolic health. I'm your host, Loïck Fenaux, and on this podcast we speak with leading experts in metabolic health, from researchers and doctors to dietitians and entrepreneurs. We're working to better understand our metabolic health. The title, Take It With a Grain of Sugar, reflects the spirit of this series. Metabolic health is a complex and evolving field. While science continues to advance, there's still areas of debate, emerging research, and gray zones in our understanding. On this show, we explore those questions together. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. For our very first episode, I'm excited to welcome Erin Glynn. Erin is an expert in metabolic health and nutrition science and has advised many wellness companies on the topic. In this episode, we'll explore why blood sugar responses vary so much from person to person and how factors like age, gender, and ethnicity influence metabolic health. Well, Erin, I'm super excited to do this with you today. So for our listeners that don't know you at all or very well, can you give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, so I am a human physiologist by training. I did my undergraduate in exercise physiology and PhD in muscle metabolism. And I really got interested more in the metabolic health side kind of at that point. Before then, I was interested in it kind of for myself, for sports physiology and being an athlete. And then once I really understood how impactful metabolic health was to long-term health, that kind of shifted my perspective. So then I did a postdoctoral fellowship in metabolomics, studying obesity and type 2 diabetes. And that kind of catapulted me into the nutraceuticals industry, which is just so focused on helping people live healthier lives. So that's what I've been doing the last 10 years, working with companies that sell dietary supplements that help people improve their health.
No, it's incredible. And so what has really brought you to kind of like that metabolic health? It's a pretty complex topic for you to, decide to put your entire career in it. What were the shifts that made you interested in this?
Well, there's certainly a lot of personal things there. I have many family members that have been affected by a variety of different metabolic issues. But I think just realizing that it affects so many people. It is one of our biggest health problems, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I really wanted to be able to have a career that I could help as many people as possible. And metabolic health is really a great place to do that.
No, I agree. And it's a bit the same for us and for me, like where it's so personal that it's something that touches everyone, but at the same time, it's very personal. So to take a step back, what is metabolic health exactly, and how does glucose and insulin play into this?
Yeah, well, so metabolic health is really based on things that drive the typical metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So it does center around blood sugar and insulin because those are such big drivers of those. But to give you an example, people that have tried to define metabolic health kind of combine many parameters into a metabolic health metric.
Okay.
And those include blood sugar, blood lipids, so that's like triglycerides and cholesterol, your blood pressure, and body fat, which they represent as waist circumference. So essentially a surrogate of visceral fat.
Okay, yes.
And so it's those four things combined that kind of give a good picture of overall metabolic health. So just to give you an example, 9 out of 10 Americans are considered metabolically unhealthy.
That's insane.
It is insane. And to have the flip side of that, that means 1 in 10 Americans is metabolically healthy, right? So there's a lot of space that we can help those 9 out of 10 people become more metabolically healthy through the things we're talking about today.
Today we'll be talking about 3 main factors that affect metabolic health, which is age, gender, and ethnicity. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? And maybe specifically, let's dive into kind of the age factor.
People's glycemic responses to meals, people's overall metabolic health, their metabolism, it is so individualized. And the main three things driving that are what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So age, sex, and ethnicity.
Yeah.
As far as age goes, we start our lives very metabolically healthy. It's like we have a new machine, right? And it's working very well. We're very insulin sensitive. And glucose is kind of increasing through childhood, but that's fine because we're insulin sensitive and we're growing. You're growing a human, in those ages between 2 to 12, right?
Yeah.
Then we hit puberty. That is kind of its own unique phase because there's so much going on with hormonal shifts. You kind of actually become a little insulin resistant during puberty. And that's a natural thing, but it is you're more shifting the focus to the hormones of growth hormone and IGF-1. And that's really what's driving growth in puberty and those changes. And most young people will come out of that and return to normal insulin sensitivity. But it is important that if you go into puberty having some factors that put you at risk for metabolic health, such as being overweight, having low physical activity, when you hit that insulin resistance in puberty, that can be an inflection point for some people to really increase their risk throughout the rest of their life. So something to consider. If you have children, when they hit that stage, it's just important to encourage healthy habits for them. And then we get to young adulthood, and from then on, it's kind of a steady decline for a lot of people over the next few decades. And we'll get into why, some of the factors that affect that.
Yeah, because I think when we think about, through age, what you mentioned with, the growth hormones and then puberty, the first thing that comes to mind is kind of like the switch of hormonal shifts that happens over getting older. But what about the evolution of your muscle mass and your fat mass? Does that also change because you age? And does that also have an impact on how you manage glucose and overall metabolic health?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most people would say that they tend to put on a few pounds every decade or so, right? And we see that in the data. And so yes, visceral fat in particular, which is the fat around your midsection, that's very metabolically active. It drives a lot of metabolic disease.
Okay.
And we know that steadily increases each decade. So just to give you an example, there was a study where they compared 70-year-old women to 20-year-old women.
Okay.
Same BMI, but their visceral fat was 3 times higher in the 70-year-old women compared to the 20-year-olds. And in males, it was about 2.4 times higher. So not quite as large of a difference, but still very large. So we tend to increase that visceral fat storage over time, and we tend to lose muscle mass. So the statistics there are past the age of 30, about 3 to 8% loss of muscle per decade.
Yeah.
Per decade. And then after age 50 or 60, depending on how active you are, that accelerates even more. So you are kind of consistently shifting from increasing visceral fat and decreasing muscle mass. And both of those things have a large impact on glycemic control and metabolic health.
And so, for myself and for listeners, so visceral fat is a type of fat? Is it opposed to another type of fat?
Yeah, so it is a specific type of fat. It has some different features, a different metabolism. So it is the fat that's stored kind of around your midsection, but importantly, it surrounds your organs. So it's really in there, and it's what people consider as maybe spare tire or beer belly, apple shape. So that tends to be visceral fat. And that's why waist circumference is often used as a measure of visceral fat. The other type of fat is called subcutaneous fat, and that's what's stored more in like the hips, buttocks, thighs areas. It's the fat you can pinch.
Yeah.
And it's kind of soft and squishy, whereas visceral fat tends to be harder. So it's kind of like a hard belly, right?
So it's interesting, like we're trying to get rid of that subcutaneous fat. That's the one we see and we don't want, but essentially when it comes to your metabolic health, the visceral fat, the one you probably don't see is...
Exactly. Yes, the visceral fat is leaps and bounds beyond damaging for our bodies compared to that subcutaneous fat. The subcutaneous fat can be protective, Women tend to store more in the subcutaneous depots, so hips, thighs, buttocks. And you're right, it does that. That is one type that we kind of focus on, but it's so much more important to think about the visceral fat accumulation and take some steps to make sure that you're not increasing that as much over time.
So that brings us, in fact, to that second factor, which is gender. And you just mentioned that visceral fat is different for women and men. Is that also is there also a difference?
That's largely driven by hormones. So estrogen is very metabolically protective. Estrogen is what tells women to store fat in those subcutaneous depots. So it kind of is directing fat to be stored outside the visceral fat, which is good. Men tend to gain more visceral fat earlier in life. That's why they tend to have higher insulin resistance. They have higher fasting plasma glucose. They get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at earlier ages and lower BMIs than women. And all of that is hormones. It's not that testosterone is bad. It's just that men don't have the same level of estrogen that's so protective.
But so does testosterone also protect men?
It does. So if you think about the things testosterone does, it promotes lean mass. So, building, it makes it easier for men to build muscle mass, which is very metabolically protective. And it's also associated with lower visceral fat. So men who have higher testosterone tend to have lower visceral fat as well. So it is protective in a way. It's just not as protective as that estrogen.
I see. And so to tie it back to the factor number one again, does estrogen and testosterone evolve over the aging of men and women? Does that change?
That's more dramatic in women. We know women go through menopause later in life around, age 51 or so. And that is a dramatic drop in estrogen, pretty much to zero. So what happens in menopause for women is they lose that protection that they've had from estrogen their whole life during their reproductive years. And that shifts risks quite a bit for metabolic health in women after they go through menopause. Now, that can be somewhat addressed with hormone therapy if something women want to do. But it's just something to be aware of. And that shift means they start storing a lot more visceral fat, and then all of their risks basically become equal to men at that point.
Okay.
As far as men go, there is also a steady decline in testosterone. So you will see that with aging. You also see it when men are overweight. About 30% of men over the age of 40 or who are overweight have low testosterone. And then that kind of creates this cycle where then you're storing more visceral fat, then you become more insulin resistant, and testosterone keeps dropping.
Interesting. And so one thing that we didn't talk about when we mentioned differences between men and women is pregnancy, obviously. So does pregnancy or that particular period also affect how women are able to manage glucose, manage insulin?
It does very much so. I mean, wild hormonal shifts in pregnancy as well. For metabolic health, it's really the third trimester that's really important. So in the third trimester, the woman becomes insulin resistant. And a lot of that is to direct glucose to the growing fetus, the baby. But if the woman is not able to compensate for that insulin resistance by secreting more insulin, then that can lead to gestational diabetes in the mom. And we really want to try to avoid that because gestational diabetes greatly raises her risk for future type 2 diabetes. So going into pregnancy as metabolically healthy as you can, trying to eat healthy, keep moving your body during pregnancy, that can have benefits for both your baby and for you.
The third factor that also impacts is ethnicity. And what I mean by ethnicity is from one end, the genetic pool you have, but also the environment you live in, where on one end you have certain traditions in certain regions of the world. Certain regions have access to certain types of food, others don't. And then obviously the socioeconomic aspect. So how does that all weave into management of glucose?
Yeah, so all of those factors that you just mentioned really can have a variety of influences on glucose control. I would say genetically, there are certainly some genes that have been identified that are different in certain ethnicities compared to others. So particularly in the Asian group, they have some less favorable genes when it comes to fat storage. That just basically makes them more susceptible to metabolic problems at lower BMIs.
Okay.
So they tend to store fat in different areas and tend to not have as high of a storage capacity for fat. So once they kind of reach a threshold, they start having metabolic issues. So the BMI cutoffs for overweight and obese in European, Caucasian is like 25 for overweight. In Asian populations, that's 23.
Oh, I didn't
know
that. Yeah.
You have to consider a little bit of your ethnicity there to know your risk in terms of that overweight thing. And then socioeconomic status, what food you have access to, that all can really play a big role. And in fact, a lot of studies that do show differences in ethnicity, when they adjust for socioeconomic status, a lot of those differences kind of fade away.
Okay.
Another part of that is, yes, they have these genes, but lifestyle still plays more of a role than genes for most people. So you're not destined to poor metabolic health with certain genetics. You have to contribute as well with your lifestyle. So I think the food environment, for instance, 70% of the world's food is carbohydrates, right?
Yeah.
And carbohydrates are what drive insulin release and glucose to go up and all of these loops that we talk about with metabolic health. So certainly considering what are the food staples with different ethnicities and can we shift those to a healthier option? So, maybe white rice to brown rice or things like that.
It's hard, it's like you said, there's so much carbs around us. Like we live in this, sea ocean of carbs. It's really hard to avoid. And then when I listen to you, it's so personal, like how everyone reacts. It's, but also your ability to react, like your ability to know about what you should and should not eat, your ability to have time to prepare the right meal over, I have 3 kids, 2 jobs, So what would you think are good advices and habits that can affect and improve your overall metabolic health?
Yeah, I think there are some really simple habits. And let's start with carbohydrates, for example. So we know that those small shifts, if you can do them from a more simple carbohydrate such as white rice to a complex carbohydrate that comes with some fiber and other natural things that are found in whole foods, so brown rice, that's going to slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream. And that's going to have a big effect on your overall glycemic response. So I call them smart carbs, choosing smarter carbohydrates with your meals. Also, the order in which you eat them can help. So simple things like I never eat carbohydrates alone by themselves.
Okay.
Never. It's just,
No
like no donut, no just plain potato chips. I always try to get a little bit of protein and or some fat that's going to slow down the spike of glucose and really reduce the overall glycemic response to that food. So just put some fiber, protein, fat in front of your carbohydrates, and that can help a lot. There's also lots of dietary supplements now that you can take that help with that. The only thing I'll say about dietary supplements, you want to make sure that you're looking for a clinically studied, well-validated ingredient, that and the product is transparent about what's in it.
So when I quickly recap what you just said about the 3 different factors, where with age, we obviously have aging means an evolution of your hormones, an evolution of your muscle mass, an evolution and a change of your fat mass. Does the microbiome also evolve with age, and does that also have an effect on managing glucose?
Yes, it absolutely does. So it has an effect throughout your lifetime, actually. The microbiome is one of the key variables for why people's glycemic responses to the same food can be so vastly different. So the microbiome kind of controls a lot of how you respond to certain foods. So that is a factor. And then as we age, the microbiome also starts to have some unfavorable changes. So you have a loss in diversity. You have a shift towards kind of more an inflammatory profile in the microbiome. So those things do happen. Just another reason to stay on top of your gut health throughout life as well, just as we think about blood sugar.
So how can you take care of your gut health? Easy tools.
Well, there's lots of things. So fiber is the big one that people think of. Fiber feeds the good bacteria in our gut. Those bacteria create things like short-chain fatty acids that have great effects on metabolism. So fiber is an easy one, and that's also great for blood sugar, right? So when you're combining fiber with carbohydrates, you're slowing the glucose curve there. You're decreasing the glucose peak. Other ways, you can take probiotics, but if you are getting a diverse diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of fiber, you're probably okay without the probiotics.
Which most of the people are probably not.
Probably not. In which case, you could consider supplementing.
Yeah. I take probiotics and prebiotics for sure. It's a no-brainer, and so that's for age and evolving. And then the other part is the difference in gender, where the big differences there is the hormone. And so you mentioned that estrogen was very protective for women. And then obviously during the menopause, that decline. Testosterone is also protected, not as much as estrogen is for women. And then lastly, the ethnicity. So what I'm kind of like my takeaways is it's incredibly personalized. Why can you eat everything you want and then you don't gain a pound, or you sleep well, or you don't feel tired? And I do with half of that.
That is exactly. But when you understand out of all of those factors, the ones you have and how that affects you, you have the power then to control what you can within those circumstances. And so I think that's why these educational things are so important for people. Is like maybe a woman doesn't know, when I go through menopause and my estrogen drops, my fat is going to shift to more visceral fat storage. So it's important for her to know so that she can try to address those lifestyle changes. She can talk to her doctor about her options. And so I hope that people have taken from this just some takeaways about their personal circumstances, that then they have some tools to go improve their metabolic health.
Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone listening to Take It With a Grain of Sugar. Remember, metabolic health isn't one size fits all. Your body is unique, and understanding how it responds to food, lifestyle, and environment is the first step towards supporting the best version of you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.